Here's where we left off last week, which was, I don't know if it was surprising to you, but it was a bit surprising to me, and that is the response by both domestic and foreign business entities to the Trump tariff initiative, and the fact that companies are lining up to increase their commitments to invest in job creating activity in the United States. So we'll see how long this goes on or how effective it is in really increasing economic output. Um, I express the warning. If you just look at GDP statistics, remember that the definition of gross domestic product is simply the dollar value of everything that's spent on. So there's a lot of not very productive activity that increases GDP. And so you have to look at that number very cautiously as an indicator that there's real economic growth going on. But at least there's this investment. Okay, so tonight what I really wanted to focus on is a discussion about monetary policy and the Federal Reserve. Um, During its long existence, the Fed has used its what I would call very limited tools in an effort to find the right equilibrium price for money and credit. The objectives have always been twofold: prevent or soften recessions and prevent or soften inflation. And this has not been easy. We have had almost continuous inflation since the Fed was created. We've had a decline in the purchasing power of the dollar almost continuously since the Fed is created. And we've had dozens of recessionary contractions, since the Fed has been created. So, what do we conclude by that? Do we conclude that the Fed's tools are ineffective, that the Fed's application of those tools has been ineffective, or that the system itself needs to be changed, and that we went down the wrong path in creating the Fed? Well, these are three little images that show you what the Fed's primary tools are. This is how they hope to influence the economy, the direction of the economy. One is open market operations, then there's the discount rate, and there are reserve requirements. So the effectiveness of the Fed's tools is revealed in the very next slide I have for you, which basically repeats what I told you about the decline in the purchasing power of the dollar. I mean, if you look at this from the 1940s on, it's been a steady decline. So what does that mean for you as an individual? If your nominal income is increasing faster than the rate of depreciation in the currency, you're doing okay. If you might be just keeping up with inflation, with the decline of the dollar, if you're lucky. And for many people, particularly in the bottom half of the population, that has not been the case at all. The purchasing power of their dollar has been declining, even as they may not even be getting any nominal increases in their household income. So, they have to resort to all sorts of workarounds, working two jobs, making sure that you have multi-generations of people in a family living in the same household with adults working, et cetera, et cetera. So, well, how severely inflation affects you, again, depends on whether your nominal income increases each year at a rate equal to or greater than the loss in the dollar's purchasing power. Since the end of the Second World War, we've had 14 recessions, the most recent being just in 2020. These recessions have varied duration and severity and have been caused by a range of factors, including initially post-war adjustments, when warriors come back and have to be brought back into the general economy, that has great disruptions in the overall economy. Inflationary pressures, triggered, in my view, largely by the cost of land and natural resources and how that travels through the economy. And then major economic events like the Great Recession of 2007, 2009, where we had irresponsibility in the financial sector, particularly with subprime lenders making very high risk loans, package them into private label mortgage-backed securities, and then getting a AAA rating from the bond rating agencies when they were really junk bonds. So you have all that, and then we get hit with COVID-19 pandemic. Uh, we have to remember that back in the 1970s, we were experiencing both high inflation and high employment at the same time. And the term stagflation was used to describe that circumstance. It was a circumstance that Keynesians said can't happen. There's always a trade-off between high inflation and high unemployment, um, but that turned out not to be true. Prices for many goods had been climbing for years as resources were diverted from general consumption to the production of war materials required for the U.S. involvement in the Vietnamese War. Um, the trigger then was the formation of OPEC as a cartel controlling both the supply and price of oil exported to the world's most fossil fuel dependent economies, including the United States. So you can see, that in this chart regarding stagflation, it's oil shocks that have a major impact on things. And then after companies get adjusted, well, after oil is discovered in the North Sea, that helps Norway and Britain and adds to the supply of oil, brings down the price as OPEC is no longer able to dictate it so effectively. And then all of a sudden, the United States our exploration for oil increases, and we find huge supplies of untapped oil, and in the United States and in Canada and in other parts of the world. So that really helped to bring down the cost of fossil fuels for a considerable period of time. And you can see the fall. The low point is 1982, and then gradually we get an increase GDP along with relatively modest inflation for a period of time. The Fed has for decades now facilitated government borrowing by essentially creating money out of thin air. This is referred to, as you know, as quantitative easing. And what that means is the money is used to invest in government securities, and the Fed earns interest on those securities, but one of the conditions of the Fed's charter is that most of its profits get turned back to the U.S. Treasury. So it's a really strange kind of relationship. They get it, they take in enough, they take in all this revenue, they keep just enough to cover their costs, and they return the rest to the Treasury. How does this all work in the economy? It's really pretty bizarre. Economist named William Luther, who's the director of the Sound Money Project. And if you've looked at the Sound Money Project, it has some controversial aspects to it, but that's not what I'm going to talk about with regard to him. He's at the American Institute for Economic Research, which was founded by Edward C. Harwood back in the 1930s, and Harwood was a Georgist. He actually served on the board of the Henry George School for some time. Okay, so AIER no longer really is at all associated with Henry George's proposals, at least not that I can find, not for many years. But here's what Luther says about the current situation. He writes, the Fed is a banker's bank. That is, banks hold deposits at the Fed, much like you or I might hold deposits in a checking account at Chase or Bank of America. That means when the Fed purchases a government bond from a bank or makes a loan to a bank, it does not have to and usually doesn't pay with cash. Instead, the Fed just credits the selling or borrowing bank's account. He goes on. The Fed does not print money to buy assets because it does not have to. It can create money with a mere keystroke. So, as the Fed buys treasuries, mortgage-backed securities, corporate debt, and other assets, money will rarely change hands. It will just move from one account to another. And finally, if I can get this to move. Indeed, there are there are two potential costs of creating money that one should keep in mind. The first results from inflation, which denotes a general increase in prices and correspondingly a fall in the purchasing power of money. The other cost is a consequence of reallocating credit. And what do you think he means by the reallocating of credit? Well, just think about what happens when the Fed increases or decreases the discount rate. And that's passed on in one way or another by banks making decisions about how much in reserve they're going to hold at the Fed, how much new credit they're going to offer to potential business or consumer borrowers, and how much they are going to add on to their own cost of funds in order to make loans. So it does have an impact on who gets access to the new money that's being created and based on the interest rates and other factors. Like in the consumer market, what's your credit score? If your credit score is 800 and something, you're going to get the most favorable rates. If your credit score is in the 700s, well, you might get a loan, but you might have to pay a premium. And if you're down in the 600s, your best bet is to go to a payday lender and pay 200 or 300% interest or whatever outrageous charges, interest rates they charged in order for you to get borrowing. So Fed policy and the decisions it makes really does have a major impact on how credit is allocated through the rest of the economy. And that has an impact on whether or not credit is allocated for truly productive economic activity, producing goods and services, or is allocated to the financial sector, which simply means that somebody gets more wealthy by buying and selling securities, equities, or bonds, and someone else loses money in that transaction. It's essentially, in my view, a zero-sum game. Well, everyone who's on this uh, call tonight has been through this discussion about modern monetary theory and monetary theory at all, how it all plays out, how much of this is real, how much of it makes sense, how much of the proposals to change our system of credit allocation and money creation makes sense. Well, there's this small group of renegade economists who argue that public debt does not really matter inasmuch as the Fed is authorized to create whatever additional monetary units are needed to pay the interest on the outstanding debt. So tax revenue, they argue, is not really that important except for social policy reasons. We want to impose taxation, for example, on bads. We want to we want to tax output of carbon dioxide. We want to we want to heavily tax the consumption of alcohol and tobacco and other kinds of sin taxes. Bad behavior. That's always been part of the solution to regulate bad behavior. Maybe we can't prevent it, but if we regulate it, maybe the costs imposed, the taxes imposed can minimize it to an extent. Okay, so other monetary reformers argue that money creation should be transferred directly to the U.S. Treasury. I'm one of those people. Uh, and this would issue the Treasury would then issue and spend debt-free money directly into the economy through the government departments. The challenge would be to do so while not causing a surge in inflation. And for those of us who are familiar with Henry George's analysis, one of the big problems there is that the land market, without appropriate public capture of economic rents, is always going to be inflationary until it stresses the economy to the point that we have a contraction, that the property markets crash because of the property prices, the expectations of sellers are exorbitant, and people just can't handle it. So let's move on. Rent seeking, deadweight loss. These are concepts we hear about in economics. They're both related to the inefficiencies and costs associated with market interventions, some of the interventions that most of us are concerned about. And rent seeking refers to the pursuit of private gains through the manipulation of the political processes or regulation. And it's almost always at the expense of the majority. Deadweight loss, on the other hand, represents the economic inefficiency that's lost uh, resulting from these interventions, such as market distortions or price controls, monopoly privileges, all sorts of subsidies. And to the extent that's a failure of governance, it's also a response to vested interest that's extremely powerful over that governance. And so it's something we're aware of and something that we try to deal with from a standpoint of policymaking from time to time, but we don't do it very consistently. And certainly with rent seeking, we have been a total failure in terms of societal intervention positively. The institution of rent-seeking privileges results in a redistribution of income and wealth from producers of goods and providers of services to non-producing rent-taking interests. Simple definition, and this chart kind of, explains it. You get both economic inequality and you get political inequality. It's something we've had. Uh, I suspect that that human beings had this even in tribal societies that were largely communitarian in structure, but there was always some segment in that society that had greater influence or because of physical strength. Um, Tribal societies had warrior classes. Um, some of them were subservient to the tribal leadership. Others had created their own cults, their own subgroup with their own leadership, and more often than not, they eventually turned their weapons on their own people. Uh, so human beings, I don't know if we're inherently good. Some of us are inherently good. Some of us be believe that we should behave morally and uh, and do the right thing. And other people say I should behave morally and do the right thing, but my morals and what I consider to be the right things are not consistent with what most people think are moral and right things. But I'm going to do them anyway because that's what I feel about things. Complex human behavior is complex. Um, I I don't pretend to understand why people behave as they do often. A major reform obstacle and to a solution that almost two-thirds of us materially benefit by the existing system to some degree. That's a problem. And that has to do with owning a residential property. So where rent seeking is concerned, there's not a homeowner, a property owner that has ever heard that term and and doesn't even think anything about the fact that when they purchase a residential property today, they expect that in 20 years they will be able to sell that to somebody else at substantially higher nominal dollars or whatever currency there is. Uh, and think that's just part of the game. This is the way that the game is designed. It's been this way forever. So, why does it need to be changed? As of the third quarter of 2004, those of us in the United States who own a residential property enjoyed on paper $35 trillion in equity based on the depreciated value of our housing unit combined with the potential sales value of the land on which the house is constructed. Rising land values added $2.5 trillion to the market value of all residential property, which hit almost $50 trillion at the end of 2024. And I mean, in my career, my life working in the mortgage banking sector, just watching the median price of a residential property climb year after year after year, and maybe fall back somewhat when there is a dramatic crash like in 2008, and then start back up almost right away. It's a remarkable, way the market works, and it enriches many and impoverishes many more. But people do not understand that or accept that there's anything systemically flawed. This chart helps to tell a bit of the story. Just look at it. I mean, there's up and down, up and down, up and down, but over the long period of time, just since 2012, which is really the beginning of when the reduced interest rates orchestrated by the Federal Reserve started to really make their way back into a growing economy. It took from 2008 to about the end of 2010 for things to start to really crank up again. For, as economists always say, for the irrational exuberance to disappear from the market and for people to start having rational expectations. And then, look what happened. So by July of 2024, the median price for a residential property is $439,170. Remember that existing housing units depreciate each year, even when they're well maintained. Based on the number I gave you, the $50 trillion total value quoted in the previous slide, I estimate that the total value of residentially improved land is about $17.5 trillion. And that's based on roughly median land to total value ratios that you would get if you saw an appraisal done on every one of these properties. So it's pretty considerable. And
Yeah.
again, when you think about it, a house, like an automobile, you buy a brand new automobile and you turn over the $50,000 to the auto dealer and
Mm.
you drive it off the parking lot and around the block
Yeah.
and you say, oh, gee, I just don't like the way this car feels. So you drive back into the dealer and you say, I'd like to, sell this car back to you. And the dealer says, okay, here's 48,400. Wait a
Yeah.
second. 5 minutes ago, I gave you $50,000. Yeah, but the car's used now. It's depreciated. Well, our house, a residential house is when it's brand new constructed, from that moment, its systems are used, everything starts to depreciate. That's why a mortgage lender gives you a 30-year mortgage and amortizes it a little bit every year. The assumption is sort of that the rate of amortization is going to roughly equal to the depreciation in the value of the house. So that if you default on the loan and they take over the house through a foreclosure process, that their ability to resell that house is going to make them whole based on how much money you still owed. And when land prices are going up, the lender benefits even more. The problem in that story is that when you're at the top of the market, buyers have, generally speaking, less cash in savings to make a sizable down payment, so that the level of financing might be 95% of the value of the property. And if the next year there's a property market crash, there's no way that there's going to be sufficient equity based on amortization for the lender to be made whole. And the statistics show that to be made whole in a foreclosure, the effective loan to value ratio needs to be about 70% because because once somebody starts falling behind on their mortgage payments, they defer maintenance. It takes months because of the legal process to go through a foreclosure, and so there's a lot of costs involved, et cetera. Uh, that's part of the market story. And then here's what we know about the markets. This is right out of the analysis by people like Phil Anderson and others who've looked at the data, look at the statistics over 100 plus years. This is how the property market cycle functions. Year 1 through 7, you've got this recovery phase from the last downturn. There's a little dip. Then you've got the rise through year 14, and then in year 14 there starts to be some cracks in the market, and by year 18 you're at the trough. You've had a crash. The last time we had this property cycle peak was 2007. The crash followed. The historical data is predictive, and if that's right, 2025, this year, will be the current peak, and the crash will be next year. Sooner, in my opinion, if the Trump policies trigger a recessionary contraction faster. And it seems to be that most mainstream economists think that that's going to be the case. So take a look at this. Telling you how ineffective government policy has been in ending homelessness, of helping the people most in dire straits. It's no matter what we were doing, we've got people living on the sidewalks. And when you look at the numbers in places like Los Angeles, California, it's unbelievable. Seattle, Washington. So let me just give you these numbers, which are really sad to think about, that in our society, which has the wealth production capacity that we have so many homeless people. And the number of homeless in 2024 that's not on this chart was up to 771,400. So in 1 year, 118,300 people lost their homes for whatever various reasons. Communities across the United States really struggle with the challenge of finding the revenue to subsidize the construction of housing that's affordable to those who are most in need. And those people are members of a small community that has very few resources that they can draw on. They cannot, given the costs of housing, provide for themselves and the cost of land. Some communities have public land that can be allocated if the members of the community aren't resisting to having that kind of high density, low income housing being put in their community. And we know this is pretty consistent around the United States, that, okay, build it somewhere else, but not near me. I don't want all those poor people, living close to me because of the way they live or whatever. Only 66,000 affordable housing units were started during 2024. The number of households that are estimated to need housing is over 4 million. And the data that I found is that right now on the drawing books, only another 78,000 housing units are planned for this year. So we have some serious problems, immediate problems, that, philosophical debates of how our government ought to be organized in the future aren't going to help us with right now. We've got to come up with the revenue. We have to come up with a way to help people that has some components of government involved and some components of philanthropy involved, and we're not doing it, or the problem is just so huge that we can't contemplate how we might try to do it. So what's coming? Okay, this is some speculation on my part. As of April 14th, the New York Times reported that there were about 55,000 confirmed discharges of federal employees, another 76,000 employee buyouts, another 145,000 reductions in federal staffing is planned by the Trump administration. This amounts to 12% of the 2.4 million civilian federal workers. And I was listening to an analyst a little while ago, and that's what prompted me to do a little research and put the next statement in there. It's worth considering, noting that a century ago there were 550,000 civilian federal workers at a time when the population was just 115 million. So as a federal worker per capita in the United States population, it's the same as it was a century ago. So I don't know what's going to happen with all of these reductions. Um, uh, what I hope will happen is that the states will step up and figure out how to raise the additional revenue to keep the programs going that lower income people need, and those most in need in our society, uh, will have access to. On April 10th, the House of Representatives adopted the Senate's version of the budget resolution, which includes $5.3 trillion in deficit finance tax cuts. The problem is that these tax cuts do not distinguish between income that is earned and income that's derived because of rent-seeking privileges under our law. That's my analysis of what's wrong with all of this. And I offer just one example of what's being ignored. The rate of taxation on any gains experienced from the sale of financial assets is defined under our tax system as a capital gain. The tax rates are effectively lower for many taxpayers than the rate of taxation imposed on wages or salaries. Actual capital goods, which includes buildings, machinery, technologies, almost never sell for more than their cost at acquisition. The only buildings that sell for more than their cost of acquisition is when they become a collectible, when they have some value beyond their economic value. It was the home where James Madison was born and grew up, or some other person of importance in our history. But for normal assets, why should gains experienced by investors engaged in speculation be given more favorable treatment than income earned producing goods or providing services? And I've talked about my, ideas about how to reform the individual income tax and the business profits tax. And I'll go into that in a few minutes with you as we have time for discussion. An expectation of the Trump's economic team is that any reductions in taxation will stimulate a supply side effect. That is, an expansion of economic output that will offset any loss in federal revenue at the lower marginal rates of taxation. And here we are in uncharted waters, because when Reagan tried to do it, it didn't happen. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but one of the main reasons is that Reagan decided to try to spend the Soviet Union into implosion. And so there were never any real cuts in the budget. There were only reductions in the marginal rates of increase in spending. So look at this chart. Here's the share of taxes paid by each income group. And at the end of this year, the 2017 Tax Cuts and Job Act will expire. More than likely, the current administration will try to get it renewed. If Congress does nothing, however, a high percentage of Americans will face increased taxes because the child tax credit will be lowered by 50%, as will the standard deduction. So depending on what changes are adopted, the distribution of which income group is progressively taxed could really change. And we'll have to wait and see what finally comes out of this. And so my final slide for this second presentation is this from the Tax Foundation. Their analysis of the tariffs on imported goods indicated it will result in an average tax increase of nearly $2,100 per U.S. household during 2025.
Whoa.
And if your income is increasing by that much or more, you're not worried about it. But if your income is flat, or you're losing your job, or one adult in your household is losing their employment because they're a federal employee who's being discharged, well, I will be looking at all of this in 2026. The total 18 module analysis that I'm now getting close to completing. Sometime next spring, I will update the whole damn thing, and we'll see what improvement has occurred through all this and how things might have gotten worse.